This is lecture number 2 for Philosophy 220, Study of Ethics. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at subjectivity and objectivity in the field of ethics.
Okay, first, most schools of thought, most schools of philosophy pertaining to ethics do hold the conviction that there is an element of universal objectivism involved in moral reasoning. In other words, that there is a right and wrong that can be applied to situations, and of course the circumstances of those situations are oftentimes taken into account. But nonetheless, there is such a thing as objective moral reasoning, a right and a wrong pertaining to actions. But one thing I want you to be careful of is that you don't confuse moral objectivism with two smaller schools of thought that do belong under the large umbrella of moral objectivism. First of all, to be objective does not mean that a person is necessarily a propositionalist. This is the belief that all moral objectivism can be expressed through principles or rules or laws. Now certainly a propositionalist believes in moral objectivism, but there are many moral objectivists that would deny propositionalism, that you can whittle down the objectivity to a statement, principle, or rule. Also, not all moral objectivists are absolutist. An absolutist is one who holds the belief that circumstances cannot change the way moral objectivism is applied. In other words, a moral objectivist can hold a certain virtue to be objective and always true, always good, and always right. But the way that virtue may be applied could change based upon a situation or circumstance. An absolutist would deny that possibility. Okay, and pictured here is the gentleman that I mentioned at the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, late 19th century philosopher, and he introduces us to the modern form of subjective relativism. I'm sorry, there is a mistake on this slide, and I will correct it later for the version that you print out. It says subjective realism here. My eye just caught that. That should be subjective relativism. And again, this belief comes about through the prominence of the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche is a name that you may have heard before because he's most well known for his criticisms denouncing religion and the existence of God. Nietzsche was one of the first modern atheists coming at that position from a philosophical point of view. But Nietzsche would also later propagate the conviction that belief in the concepts of good and evil are ill-founded, that there really isn't any such thing as good or evil, but these ideas have been imposed upon us by society, whether that be a religious society or not. The textbook in which Nietzsche puts forth this idea that good and evil are fictional is the book entitled Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche reasoned that the most natural human condition, at the core of our being, we are invested in a quest of self-preservation, of making sure that we go on for as long as we possibly can. Perhaps you hear in that the Darwinian concept. I know some of you have a science background. The Darwinian concept of survival of the fittest. Nietzsche also argues that the decisions we make, therefore, that we may call moral decisions, are actually instinctual, relative to what best serves our survival. And you can see the term relative there in bold. So not a sense of an objective good or bad, but we decide in each situation instinctually what it is that will continue to allow us to be. Those who continue to live in the fictional realm of good and evil, whether that's because of religious beliefs or whether it is because of the belief of moral objectivism, which Nietzsche denied. Nietzsche would argue that those individuals have not evolved into the highest state of being, which in German is Übermensch. We could translate it as the overman. The overman, the Übermensch, is the one who has learned to abandon these societally or culturally enforced concepts of good and evil. The Übermensch is the one who has learned to leave those things behind. And so therefore anything that you would call good or evil, according to Nietzsche's subjective relativism, is simply that which makes sure that you continue to go on. And in a broader sense, that your species or your family or the people who are citizens of your same nation state continue to go on and on. Okay, we can move past subjective relativism into cultural relativism. This does not make ethics or morality relative to the individual, but relative to the community. The primary assertion that is held in cultural relativism is that no culture has the moral authority to judge the rightness or wrongness of another culture's actions and customs. Let me give you a couple of examples here, one that perhaps is a little humorous or lighter in nature, and then one that's a little more serious. Some of you may have heard that in Asian cultures, most especially China and Japan, that a custom when one is eating is to not let out an extremely loud fraternity boy belch, but to offer a very quiet belch at the table. You are supposed to eat in a hasty manner, a quick manner, and when you have soup before you are intended to slurp the soup. All of these actions communicate to your host that you find the food so good that you cannot wait to eat it, and the belch is a way of showing satisfaction that you have enjoyed and your appetite has been satiated by what has been provided to you. So those very actions are expected and are considered good in that Asian culture or context, whereas some of those very things in Western society would be considered rude table manners. So this is an example here how from one culture to another we can see table manners are very different, and that belongs again to the lighter sphere of moral reasoning. Now let's look at a much more controversial picture that we have here at the top right, and this is from an Islamic culture, a criticism of Western culture. We can see a young Western woman depicted here on the left, and of course we have a Muslim woman wearing the full burqa on the right. Now, first of all, let me talk about the Western position that's being criticized here. The Western position is one that would argue that there is a very even sometimes violent form of patriarchy within Islamic culture that tries to keep women at a lower place in society than men, and so that is therefore why the woman has to wear this burqa that covers her entire body, so that, according to Western culture, so that she does not become a sexual temptation to man in showing a part of her body. And so therefore this is seen to somehow spiritually protect the man from the Islamic culture. And so many American feminists would come forward with the criticism that this supposedly keeping a woman in her place is, again, misogynist. If that's a new term for you, that means a hatred of women, that this is a misogynist position, and that Islamic women need to be free from that sort of oppression. Now here the Islamic artist is making the argument that it is actually the American woman or the Western woman who is blind to the fact that she's the one who is oppressed, that her society has turned her into a sexual object, and that she is expected to dress in a sexy or sensual way to appease the men in her culture. And so what the Islamic artist has done here is to take the one part that is not covered in the burqa, the eyes, and to say that the Islamic woman really sees, and that the American woman is the one that is blind. So I give this to you merely as an example of cultural relativism of the Islamic society, saying you have no right to make to assert that your culture is better than my culture and to make this judgment upon me. And of course the Western response is the one that is more readily available to us. It would be to say that the Islamic culture doesn't have the right to exalt their culture above us and make these derisive comments about the way American or Western women dress. So again, that's a couple of examples of cultural relativism. Let me give you one that I think is the most shocking, that's actually in your textbook, so I won't spend a lot of time here. You read perhaps the little box example in the textbook that talked about clitorectomies that take place in some African cultures, and this is when the clitoris of an African girl is removed, the idea being that this will keep sexual behavior in the culture and the tribe from becoming something that is immoral. The idea being that because the clitoris is a primary place of sexual stimulation for the woman, that by removing that she won't become a temptress to men. Now this is a very, from a Western perspective, an extremely violent action. I would also, I am a feminist, and so coming from a feminist perspective, I would say this is also very much a misogynist, grossly patriarchal act. But a cultural relativist would say to me that I have no right to make that assertion because I'm stepping out of my culture and making a judgment against another culture. Okay, and lastly, we have emotivism, and emotivism is the dismissal that there is even any such thing as moral reasoning, that it does not exist. It's an impossibility to reason about morality. And this is the position held by philosopher A.J. Ayer, who is pictured here, and he is mentioned in your textbook reading. The thesis of emotivism is that we arrive at our convictions of good and bad, or right and wrong, through our attitudes or through an emotional response we have to something, and not through moral reasoning. That what we call ethics is actually beyond, is actually beneath the sphere of moral reasoning, that it is always an emotional response, an attitudinal response. Therefore, someone could not convince you to change your conviction about the morality or the immorality of an action through reason and argument, but only through impressing his or her attitude upon you until this influenced your very own attitude. To give you one example here, let's say that your position was one of being convinced that homosexuality is immoral, and A.J. Ayer would say there's no one that could convince you through reasoning or logic to change that position, but only through having a very strong attitude. You would either be entrenched more in your position because the attitude would turn you off, or the attitude would maybe inspire a different passion or emotion within you that would bring you to their side.